super, super excited to do this episode. This is the third episode of Data Dialogues. We started Data Dialogues 2 months ago, and the whole point of it was to bring together the data community, to bring in leaders in the data space to talk about interesting topics which may or may not be sort of spoken about otherwise. So for episode 3, this is a particularly exciting episode. We have the two big Benns in the data space. We have Benn Stancil, who's the co-founder of Mode. Mode was recently acquired by ThoughtSpot. And we also have the other Benn, Single N, who is also famously known as the Seattle data guy who lives in Denver. So super excited to have both of you. Thank you so much for being on the show. And looking forward to having a fun conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having
us. One of the things which I'm very excited to sort of chat about is, I think we have a very unique perspective. We have, each of you play different roles in the data space. If I think about what it takes for a company to get value from data, you need product, all of the different categories which we have, and that is really interplayed along with, data teams, which are people. So, Benn with two N's is, very much in sort of in the product side. Mode was one of the first data companies, and Benn with single N, with the consultancy, with the Seattle data guy, a lot of what you talk about is the people of data. So, very interested in sort of diving deeper and, understanding where each of you sort of come from. What I thought would be really a cool place to get started is the ThoughtSpot Mode acquisition. Benn, would love to kind of understand from a strategic perspective why this was, sort of particularly interesting, and how does the sum total of these two sort of businesses add more value to the people of data and stakeholders.
Yeah, so I can give you kind of the quick summary of Mode, ThoughtSpot, and kind of how this all happened. So Mode, if you're not familiar, was a tool that was started. We basically started it to build a product for analysts and data teams, and so that's where we came from. We were working on a data team that was one of these teams that was responsible essentially for getting questions from people around the business and trying to answer them by writing SQL queries and making charts and sending things out to other folks. And we weren't building dashboards. We were answering questions like this number on this dashboard's gone down, like what is going on? And we, sort of scramble to answer some question that our CEO was yelling at us about. Ultimately, over time, that product got pulled into becoming sort of a BI tool. And this is a thing I think that I've said a number of times and have become very much a believer in it. Every product that is kind of a data tool for data consumption becomes a BI tool. And the reason for that is that the users of that thing are going to be business stakeholders, are going to be the people who are getting the reports from the analysts. They're going to start asking for can I drill into this? Can I do more self-serve? Can I turn it into a dashboard? All of the things that are kind of classic BI are the types of things that folks are going to ask for. And so Mode had this sort of strong foundation in building a product for analysts, but was slowly moving towards becoming a BI tool in a more classic sense, because that's what you're always going to get asked to do. ThoughtSpot basically was the opposite. ThoughtSpot was a product that also was started around the same time as Mode was, focused very much on business users. Their entire initial product was this kind of search-based BI thing where you could ask questions in natural language and it would generate queries for you. And that went through some evolutions. And now obviously with a lot of the stuff around generative AI, it's sort of really accelerated what they're doing there. But the whole core of it was, can we make this really, really easy for business folks to answer questions without having to talk to a data team? But they had to have data teams involved in that, because data teams have to build kind of the underlying models, and there are obviously questions that sometimes that sort of natural language thing can't answer, so they have to ask a data team and often open up another tool, because ThoughtSpot didn't really focus on that problem. And so ultimately what we realized was they were starting to solve the problem for how do we help analysts like ThoughtSpot more? How do we make sure that we don't just say kick you out to some other tool when you get these questions? For us, we were building stuff that was more kind of consumption for end users. Both of us were kind of coming at the same thing of how do we blend these worlds together, but each of us only had half of the solution. And so ultimately that's really the real rationale was every company kind of needs both sides of this. Can they buy it in one product? And it's really like, can they buy it in one buying experience that is well integrated, rather than they can buy it in a single product? We don't really view this as, let's take, this is sort of, we were talking about this before, let's take Microsoft or Google Sheets and Google Docs and Google Slides and turn it all into like this kind of Notion, one product to rule everything, one single interface product. Like, we don't think that really works. We'd rather say, no, you got Google Sheets, you got Google Docs, you got Google Slides. These are kind of different experiences, but if they integrate really well, where the charts you copy from one work really well on the other, that's a much easier experience to use than having to jump around between sort of actually disparate products sold by different vendors and those sorts of things. So that's ultimately where it all came from, and we're now in the early stages of a lot of the details about that.
That sounds really exciting. So what I hear is, keeping it as two separate products, but really become really very interoperable in the space. And being able to take analysis from one and push it into the other, and really become a lot more cross-functional.
Basically, like the easiest, so ThoughtSpot has this kind of search-based model. You take data, you can search it, you can like describe the charts you want to see, and it will create them. Mode has ways to create these sort of data sets, and it's always been like a visual explorer type of interface that's in on top of it. So one of the integrations that's relatively straightforward is, what if you create a data set in Mode using SQL and things that analysts really like, and then you can search it the way that you can in ThoughtSpot. So it's like sort of moving between the tools in that way, but not saying like, oh, let's just smash a SQL editor into ThoughtSpot or something like that.
Yeah. Benn with a single N would love to, I think maybe just, get a sort of quick introduction, sort of on yourself. And, what I would really kind of love to hear your thoughts on is, how have you seen, the interaction between the sort of data teams and the business? Have you seen like how is this sort of working, from your point of view, and sort of what do you think about this sort of acquisition and sort of the direction which Benn with two N's shared?
Yeah, I mean, quick background, I focused a lot on being the person that uses all these tools. So I do a lot of consulting and helping people set up their data infrastructure, and helping try to figure out what the tools are to best benefit the data team and the business team, and figuring out how to actually answer the business questions. I think that's like, in terms of like how teams operate and how businesses and data teams operate together. I mean, I've seen every which flavor, right? Like somewhere, the business just wants as much access to data as possible, and the data team is trying to service that. And then on the other side, you've got some instances where it's like the business wants very little to do with the data, and it's just like, data team, build us the things we need, and you just have to understand what we're saying and translate that. And then of course, hybrid versions of all of those in between, and different companies have different things, different teams work differently. But at the end of the day, everyone's just trying to figure out, how do we take this information and actually translate it into some sort of business result, I think is generally the end goal. And
yeah,
I think tools like ThoughtSpot and Mode, that's what they've been focused on. I've actually recently had a project with Mode where it was like, it wasn't even data engineers or data analysts building things on it. It was a product manager who was like, I'm using this, I'm writing my own queries, and then I'm building off of that. So I've seen pretty much everyone use a variety of these tools, and some people just upskill themselves to try to use what they have. Other people, right, like might just want to go somewhere like directly to ThoughtSpot and be like, look, I just want to ask the question. I just want to type in the answer, or I just want to give me the answer, right? Like I have a question, I want to give me an answer. Which is often like another kind of way, if you're talking about interacting data teams and business teams, how they interact, it generally is one of the ways that is the classic way we all like to joke about, which is, hey, just give me this data. Like, hey, can you pull this answer for me really quick? So I think there's definitely a lot of ways I see tools like, ThoughtSpot and Mode, especially thinking about how they could work together, be set up for that. Like, just answer the questions that these business people are asking all the time anyways, and then reducing the need to especially have some of these like lighter questions get answered. So yeah.
Do you see like a gap?
Sorry,
go on.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, one other thing that's sort of an interesting thing about the persona stuff, and this was a very big surprise to us when we built Mode. To your point, Ben, about like the product managers using Mode to write SQL and stuff. We largely built Mode originally around the idea that there's like data teams, there's everybody else, and there's like, it's a very clear line of, some people want one thing and everybody else wants a different thing. And in practice, it's like, 15% of Mode's users are actually data team folks that live in it, write a ton of SQL queries. 50% are just like consumers who are just looking at charts and dashboards and that sort of stuff. But then there's about a third of the users are actually these like incidental analysts that are product managers or marketing managers or people in operations or finance or engineers or whatever that want to write queries sometimes. And they are either people that are like, yeah, sometimes I do it, or often they're also people who didn't have any exposure to SQL, started seeing it in the tools they use, and we're like, this isn't so hard, I can figure this out. And so there is like, we tend to talk about this as this there is a business user and an analyst, and these are kind of the personas, but there's actually a really, really big group, probably bigger than the analyst group, that is these kind of like semi-technical Excel extended type of folks that are technical-ish and can certainly learn how to use a lot of these tools if they get exposure to it. So it's like a slightly different, it's a surprise to us that that's how it was set up when we first built Mode, but like we very much realized that was a group of people we had to build stuff for.
Yeah. I love that. And, wanting to go a little bit deeper into the people, right? Because, we have so many conversations on what's this tool and what's the BI tool for you and what's the ingestion and the warehouse and all of this. But, the other half, if not, of sort of off the data world is the sort of people of data. So, would love to kind of understand, as you spoke about having different consumers and, only 15% of them are data teams, is from a product perspective, how do you build for having multiple personas? And, if there's one, I think frustration is the wrong word because we're ultimately here to serve people. But, what are some of the challenges of having, of like trying to build a tool which was built for data teams and now having, 85% of your users who are not data teams?
So I think there's a little bit of I have a couple thoughts on that. I don't know that I have any answers, but I have a couple thoughts.
Yeah.
One is that I think you have to be really careful about trying to build one size fits all. Like there is a temptation, especially in tools that have sort of they build a hammer, they really like it, it's a good hammer, and they try to apply it to everything. And I think like Tableau is a pretty good example of this. Tableau is a great visualization tool. They do a really good job with visualization, but they kind of turn that into, okay, everybody should be building visualizations in this way. And there's a lot of things, and our view of this was like, well, there's some places where like, Tableau is essentially a really, really elaborate pivot table. There are some places where like a pivot table works really well, but sometimes just like writing a SQL query is way easier than doing this in a pivot table. And so I think that like part of it is, and for us, it was kind of like SQL was the hammer that we tried to apply in a bunch of different places. And, we ran into a bunch of business users that were like, they'd open up the code editor and were like, it's not that hard, you can learn this. And they're like, oh my God, I never want to see it. Some people eventually learned it, but a lot of people were just like scared off by it. So I think part of it is like you have to actually meet people where they are, and that's going to mean different experiences. The other thing is, and this is probably more true for smaller startups, Mode was sort of on the fence of where this is. ThoughtSpot and now Mode is big enough, I think they can do this for multiple personas. I think you have to be comfortable saying like, you must be this tall to ride this ride, not necessarily this tall in like a technical sense, but just it's okay saying this is not for some people. It's okay saying like, hey, actually, if you're trying to solve a different problem, we're not going to solve that for you. Go somewhere else. We're going to really focus on the thing we're good at. If you are Mode, that might mean SQL stuff. If you are ThoughtSpot, that might mean we're really going to focus on kind of the search-based BI. Now it's combined, obviously we can do more than that. But like for the earlier stage companies, I think there's a real temptation to be pulled in a bunch of directions trying to solve for all of these personas. And it's like, you should just focus on one or two and do a really, really good job of those. And if somebody says, hey, we want something different, it's like, that's not who we're for. There's a lot of other tools out there probably to solve that problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. Benn with a single N. I really need a better name.
You're all good. What was I trying to think? One, I just think that's a great way of covering it. I think some tools do end up falling into the like, let's try to be useful for everyone. And I think some tools just don't speak to everyone. I think this is like, you can have your feelings on Databricks and Snowflake. I think this is the interesting thing that you're seeing there is like, they're like, Databricks is like, we want to be the data warehouse and the data, like everything. But when I look at it, I'm like, yeah, you can build a data lake house, but like the way you use that tool to me is like, this is great for data science and ML. Yeah, some data engineering, but I feel like it's really geared towards that. And then I look at Snowflake and I think like, okay, this is great for data warehousing. Costs are different, but like, at least from like what they look like in the UI and how they feel. And I do think like certain tools are just built well for different people. And I think, I don't know. I get that everyone needs to grow their market share. So maybe, it's silly to be like, oh yeah, you just Benn's like,
yeah, and there's like there's very much like a startup dynamic in this, especially in the data world, because everything is all sort of blended, that everybody is pretty close together. So it's really easy to just be like, well, this one is, we already do 75% of what they need. Why not add the extra 25%? And like, it's not jumping from, oh, we sell to salespeople, let's now go sell to marketers. And it's like a totally different world. It's selling to a SQL analyst and an analyst that kind of likes to write Python, and a analytics engineer and a data engineer, and all of the kind of weird fuzzy things in the middle, or selling the persona of building dashboards versus answering questions versus operational reporting versus data apps. Like, all these things have a lot of overlap. And so it's really easy to kind of creep your way into something that is for everybody, this kind of, Snowflake or Databricks thing, where these use cases all blend. And so it's like, oh, if we just add one or two features, now we can sell this whole other use case. And it's like, that's how you end up with this kind of Frankenstein that's not really for anybody.
I think you sort of bring up a really interesting point, right? Like, we have, especially in the last 5 years, made more and more roles, right? Like, analytics engineer became a thing, and data visualization and data platform and data analyst and data scientist. We've made all of these different roles, and that made sense because, some tooling was very, very specific, like DBT, sort of famously built the analytics sort of engineer, and sort of data engineers were initially building models and ingestion and, all of these different things. Do you see, with, I love what sort of ThoughtSpot and Mode are going, and in some ways being able to serve more personas, not actively like sales and marketing, but being able to do more from a tool. Do you think that, as the world is becoming more efficient now, and, I think at the, last year was the peak of spend more money on data and this promise of being data driven, do you think the world is going to, in some ways, where there's so much talk about consolidation of infrastructure, and, do you think data teams will also start consolidate, where instead of these specific roles, we're going to start to see the rise of the data generalist?
Ben probably has more. I have some thoughts, but Ben probably.
I'm trying to think. Like I think like there's always like room for a data generalist. So I'm like, most companies like naturally have that. I think generally when you see more generalist roles, you tend to just be in smaller companies or companies with, generally smaller budgets. And then like, as you get larger, right? Like if you go into an enterprise, like you have people that are literally focused on data governance, which is like just how the data, it's not even like someone that's writing queries, it's someone setting up the policies and the methods and the processes in a way that the data will be accessed, how it'll be accurate, all these things that like almost have nothing to do with the technical side to a degree, and have more to do with like how people interact with it. So, as you go up on larger companies, you'll always have more roles.
Is that a function because those larger companies in general have just lived in very disjointed worlds, right? Like, 10, 15 different tools and bad processes. If those, that starts to mature more, like, adoption of more consolidation, tools doing more, making this easier, more interoperable, would you, like, what I always try to understand is this problem actually, have we created this problem? And, are the innovations which are now happening, are these going to result in maybe not having to have 10 sort of dedicated people on data governance as one dedicated person, or actually is a generalist able to do this piece because it's really well integrated? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think when you look at like larger companies, I think it's an unavoidable reality. Like if you go into a larger company, it's not we're a Snowflake shop. It's the marketing team is a Snowflake shop. That team, that team is the whatever Databricks. That team is using BigQuery and Databricks. Like people just start to add things on for various reasons. Sometimes it's just because mergers exist, right? Like we bought 10 companies, now we have to deal with all of their data warehouses. Sometimes it's just like the natural kind of expansion of whatever, it just happens over time. So I don't know if it's like, can you ever fully get control of it? I always have this story where I remember listening to the CTO who told me, he's like, oh, I was once hired at a company, and one of the goals I was given was to lower the number of apps that we were using and applications we were relying on. And when I joined, we were using like 200. And then by the time I quit 2 years later, we're using 250. So that there is like, even when you like put concerted efforts into like trying to reduce things, it just feels like somehow people naturally start adding things. Actually, I remember at Facebook, we were using Tableau and then an internally developed BI tool. And then someone was like, on our team was something like, yeah, we should also add Metabase. And I was just like, what does Metabase do that we don't currently get out of Tableau and then the internally developed BI tool? But it's like there does seem to be this natural desire to like add more rather than insert down. But yeah.
That makes sense,
I don't know
Ben.
if that actually answers the question for
No, it
the
does.
roles consolidating, but yeah.
I do have a follow-up question, but I would love to hear, Ben, I know you had some thoughts.
On the roles, I mean, one of like I guess the kind of pointed question a little bit in this is like, are analytics engineers real? Like, is that a real thing?
What's the difference in a data engineer and an analytics engineer?
I do think that is I do think it is a real thing. I don't know that it's a real, like, obviously it's gone through a lot of hype and it becomes sort of very specifically tied to DBT and things like that, and kind of this very specific type of workflow of like ELT to analytics engineer to, you know, like there was the sort of modern, or is, I guess, like the modern data stack flavor of what that means. I don't know that will exactly persist in its exact form, but I think the idea of like a data engineer is someone who is, that is an engineer. That is an engineer that is just understands data technology. Like that is someone who probably comes from an engineering background that is having to do things that takes a long time to actually be like skilled enough to be able to do. I do think that is a very distinct thing. To me, the analytics engineer, it's basically an analyst, like an analyst and analytics engineer, essentially the same kind of skill set. It's more of like, what kind of problems do you want to solve? And in a small company, you got to do everything, to Ben's point. Like, that's just how it's going to work. But if you have a little bit of specialization, to me, it's like there are some people who really like talking to people. They really like sort of solving problems, telling stories, building decks, blah, blah, blah. Like, great. That person probably doesn't want to think about a system. The analytics engineer to me is someone who like is the type of person who constantly gets frustrated by, this thing is broken and I want to fix it. And like I pull on a thread and I find these other 5 things I want to fix. And there is a type of person that there's like an XKCD comic about like, pass me the salt. And then they have to I'm going to build some general case for like, if you ask me any condiment, I can pass you that. And it's like, engineers often think this way, where they're like, I need to generalize this solution into something that isn't a one-off thing. And I think there's some people who are drawn to that sort of problem. I think like analytics engineers are basically analysts that think that way and want to just do the, like, how do I solve this problem in a generalized way? And so I think there's actually a lot of use to that, as, you know, we see the data stacks get sort of out of control or whatever. Having someone whose essentially job it is to rationalize that and say like, no, let's actually think about how we're doing all of this so that it makes sense and it's consistent across different departments or across the different problems we're trying to solve within this department. That doesn't, I don't think, means like the job is to write DBT models. I think that is part of it potentially, but I think it is more of like, that is a real job, but it's a real job to say, hey, we have this tons of things that sort of splinter off, to Ben's point about all the tools we buy. Can we think about this more like systematically as, what are we trying to build as a collective unit? Not, oh, I need to run a report. I'm going to go build another report on top of something else. Like, there's an easy way to just build tons of these little kind of splinters of stuff. And I think someone who's thinking about how do we make sure we don't do that is actually a pretty useful role.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you think this, and I think one of the things which we don't speak about enough is how things change as a company scales, like the needs of a startup of, a sort of 20-person, 100-person, 1,000-person, and a 10,000-person company are like vastly different. And I think tools in some ways, are sort of pick a certain direction, right? Like, ThoughtSpot is fairly on the bigger on the bigger side, and something like Metabase would be some things which like earlier stage companies use, right? And you have some tools which sort of become relevant, which are sort of relevant, for like many sizes like DBT, but then you have the Informaticas, which sort of do that especially for like larger scale. So, I think on the data products perspective, it's somewhat clear, or there's some, I think there's always going to be gray areas, but it's somewhat clear. How does data teams really evolve as this happens, and is that really is that pretty clear as to what the evolution of data team look like as the sort of company size scales? Does that make sense?
I think
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ben. No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, yeah, I think it makes sense. Is like, a question as to what happens to data teams and the roles and things like that as a company grows. I don't think there's a consistent answer to that. I think that depends on like basically what the company is trying to do. To me, there are really two major buckets you probably could put companies in. You could put companies in for which like data is genuinely a strategic investment. It is something that really matters. The business relies on using data to be more effective.
What's an example of a company in that bucket?
DoorDash.
Sure.
Like DoorDash can't function as a business unless the product doesn't work unless there is a fair bit of data infrastructure underneath it to actually make this thing happen. Like if I order something on DoorDash and it comes in 3 days, like that's not a functional product.
Yeah.
But for most businesses, I actually don't think that's the case. Most businesses, data is actually mostly just a reporting function. Like we can talk about it being so much more and talk about it being like it's our strategic advantage. I don't actually know that I believe that. I think like it's a very valuable thing. You need to have it. You need to know what's going on in your business. You need to be like a well-informed company about the state of, what sells well and what doesn't. But I think that is mostly like reporting and BI. And so I think for those companies, like building data is essentially building sort of coherent reporting and BI functions, where it's someone who can answer questions, someone who can build rational models, someone who like able to get data from the source systems that have all of that useful information and turn it into something that's actually like reliable reporting. So it's like a kind of boring problem, but so is accounting, and everybody needs to do accounting. And so I think like there is some version of data that is just accounting of a different sort. And so I think actually in a lot of companies, that's actually more or less what it really should look like.
Yeah. You think these companies like, everyone's talking about AI and insights and all these things. Like, are you saying like, I mean, sort of zooming out from a slightly different perspective, right? Like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, digital marketing itself was a competitive advantage. Did you do it or did you not do it, right? And all of a sudden today, everyone is doing it, right? Like, you're no longer going to see in a pitch deck that, hey, we have a really good strategy because we are using Facebook ads. So when everyone sort of starts getting saturated, when this no longer becomes a competitive advantage, what is the next competitive? What is the next alpha? And for like many of these companies, for e-commerce, for SaaS, for fintech, for any of these applied things, data has to become that alpha. So, my sort of question back to you is very interesting what you said, but as you think about the next 5 years, isn't even for the companies where today it's just BI, isn't the alpha going to become, are you smarter at, acquiring your customers? Are you smarter at personalizing your product? Are you smarter at sort of being able to recognize churn? Or do you not, or do you think that's still just a pipe dream and you think it's not really meaningful?
I think like the one thing that I'd say there's like, right, like when you think about that, the way companies are relying on digital ads is not through their own systems though, right? Like it's through like they're relying on someone else's system that operates well. And yes, you have to have the strategies and the people that can work with it to implement it. And I think that's kind of the same thing here, where it's like there will be tools that are developed probably via AI that you can then work with. And you have experts who can work with those tools that you can get that set advantage, but you likely will not be the one that builds them, right? And that's generally how a lot of these companies operate, right? Like it's like, look, Fred Meyers or Kroger is not going to go out and likely be the one that builds the LLM that gives them the competitive advantage. But they have the data, and if they can take that data and structure it in a way that can be fed into whatever company builds a LLM or whatever it is product that can then translate things like detecting churn faster or doing something like that will be likely the reality for some of these companies. It probably will not be we built the ad system. We provided the experts to feed the information correctly so that we get the right outputs, because we ourselves probably shouldn't be spending time on trying to build the correct, whatever that AI system is.
At the risk of, sort of, I don't know, saying stuff that
I love
isn't necessarily what I should be saying as a data vendor. I think that like data is not really like, it could be a competitive advantage in some cases, but I actually think for the most part there's easier ways to go. That like if you think about there are places to me where it is, And if it can be, and like you can save a bunch of money if you use this correctly, where you can identify, we can be more efficient in certain areas. If you are a business of a certain scale, data can certainly be a huge competitive advantage. And I think, for Amazon, if Amazon does things smartly in how they deliver, or, how can they lower various costs that other people can't, there's a huge advantage, I'm sure, in that. If airlines can be more efficient in, their routes and things like that, they can charge lower for tickets, and that's all great. And that can certainly be a big advantage for smaller companies. Honestly, I think it's a little bit of a myth. I think it's the kind of thing where people say well, we'll make better decisions, but in practice, you can also just be really fast in the decisions you make and stick to them. And I think you're probably better off than you are trying to convince yourself that you have all of this really great data and you're going to make all these really great decisions with it. I think it's basic reporting again that is really what you need, and then make sort of 80% good decisions, but make them fast and make them confidently and stick to them. You're actually going to be able to better business with that than I think you will with we are going to just be the most data-driven Series A e-commerce startup in the world. It's you're probably better off just kind of talking to customers periodically and making some decisions with that. So I think it's data can be an input to some competitive advantages for some businesses. There are certainly ways in which it's very valuable, but I think as a general, every business will die unless they are deeply invested in data in 5 years. Feels like a thing that we've been saying for 15 years.
Wait, what is
actually? Sorry, it's just funny. Yeah.
So, I mean, how did we get into this hype cycle in terms of, what I hear you say is that, in general, unless you're really, multi-billion-dollar company, you need some ingestion, warehousing, modeling, BI. What do you see as all of these new categories around observability, governance, reverse ETL, all of these other things? Do you think that a lot of them are hype, and in the next 5 to 10 years, because I think the world has become more efficient, right? I think, the way we would spend money a year and a half ago, I don't think that's going to happen again. But would love to hear your thoughts on, where do you see in terms of spend going? And then what do you see as the future of some of these categories, which are trying to do level 2, level 3, level 4 stuff, assuming that companies keep investing in data?
So quickly a few points, I guess, on that. One is on the new categories. I think that they are real problems. There are real issues to be solved there. So I think there is some appeal to that. And there are pain points. There are, governance and observability and all those kind of things are real problems. I think it makes sense to try to solve them. So I don't think that it's all hype in the sense that none of this it's not crypto. It's not totally invented. That said, I think one of the reasons they exist is because a lot of folks look at the really, really big companies, the Netflixes and the Ubers and the Googles and the Facebooks, and say, these people did it really well. We can do that too. And it's the problems they're trying to solve are fundamentally different. That Facebook can do really great things with data because their data is actually valuable. If you are a dog walking startup, or you are a startup that sells a SaaS platform for some CRM type thing, it's not going to be as valuable as a giant social network where you're trying to serve ads. It's just not that useful. And so I think some of it's applying the best practices from people who are trying to solve one problem with one set of resources to something else that doesn't actually quite fit. Doesn't mean there isn't things to do better with data.
Let's take let's take a $200 million e-commerce company, right? They have, some size, some scale. Should a business like this actually, if hypothetically, if you're able to make something 5%, 10% more efficient, we're talking about $10 million plus, for a business like this, which one of these things are actually relevant?
Sure. I think that is a worthwhile thing. I don't know that though it is something where it's this is our huge strategic advantage, or it's it is the same to me as let's have good accounting. Let's have good performance management policies. If you do good performance reviews, can you make your company 5 to 10% better? Probably. You can, you will find slightly better people. They will be slightly more performant, all those sorts of things. Nobody sits around and talks about how that is an enormous, this is the future of business, is better performance management. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but it's just not this revolutionary thing. And so I think for a lot of companies, data is the same. That's, again, there's a lot of things you should be buying. There's a lot of good investment. You have to have certain tools to be able to support that. But I think the idea of this is the thing that we absolutely have to do or else it's all over is a a little bit of data folks getting excited and trying to sell products. Okay, I get it. Makes sense. It's how everybody's going to do it. Like, I'm sure the people who sell HR software probably say this is the future of, like, you know, how we build businesses is great performance management. I don't know. I doubt it is, but like, it probably sells.
Exactly what like Matt says.
You know, I'm sure that, yeah, I'm sure that Bamboo tells you that the differentiator between a great company and a bad company is like a well-communicated org chart. I don't.
It's too funny. It's too funny.
You know, but to the last thing I'd say to your category question, I do think actually there will be some like category collapse here where some of these tools aren't really sustainable as like billion-dollar businesses. They got overinflated, I think, in two ways. They got overinflated in one, like the market was a huge bubble in the sense that like multiples were all crazy, and we all know that. But the other part was they also like were built on top of markets that are pretty unproven. That like, how big is the observability market really?
Yeah.
The total number of customers across all the observability companies is probably less than 1,000. Like, no, that may be real. We may be totally, like, that could be very real, and that's the beginning of an enormous wave. But like, that's a pretty big bet to say this is going to be something. There's going to be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of companies buying this kind of tooling. Whereas I think, and I have some bias here, like BI is at least a proven product. We know we need to do that. We know we need data warehousing. We know we need some like ETL type of tools. But these other ones, it's more speculative, not just in terms of like the businesses themselves, but the market is pretty speculative of like, how big is that category at all? And I don't know, again, maybe it's big. I'm not saying it's like definitely not, but I'm saying it's a much bigger question mark than like data warehousing. Like, we know that Oracle can be an enormous business selling a bunch of old databases. Like, so can Microsoft, so can data. Like, that is a real market. Can Snowflake go after those and be as big as those other people? I have no idea. But like, they're selling something we know people are going to buy.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just go ahead.
No, I was just
okay. Okay, perfect. Sorry. But yeah, no, I was just gonna add, like, I think to add to that, it's not just like, can a single company, but can there be 10 companies or 30 companies? Because that's like in most of the spaces right now, right? Like, if you're looking BI alone, I don't know, Ben, do you know how many BI companies you felt like you were competing with?
There are so many. Oh my God.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, like, and that could actually arguably be sustainable, like, to in a weird degree, right? Like there is a market for probably 30 plus BI tools, you know, that where they could sell to different sizes of companies. Maybe some sell to specific niches, you know, maybe we just do finance charts really well, whatever. But the question becomes like, okay, you know, you pick something like observability. It's like, do you have enough? Like, is the problem data quality real? Yes. Are people now willing to spend on it? That is the next harder question. And then the other part is like, is there enough sustained spend for 30 companies? And you know, right now, I imagine it's a very hard space to be in, because you're having to like convince people that yes, you need to spend money here. Where again, people know they need to spend money on BI, or feel like they know at least.
And it can be easily attached, easily in a very hand wavy, sort of obnoxious way to tell an engineer this is easy to build sort of way, but like easily attached to other products. Like, it kind of makes sense. It's like, oh, we already have these other tools. If someone adds observability to this, or adds a data catalog on top of some other tool, like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. I think there are a few categories that people are going to definitely be like, yes, we know we need to buy this. But if the observability market is huge, some of those big tools are going to try to do it. Like, I think it's just harder to be a standalone thing. It's the question, like, is this a feature or a product? It's somewhere in the middle, probably, but I think that just makes it tough. It could be huge, but seems tough.
What does that roll up even look like, right? Like, you mentioned some of these categories might collapse and be sort of integrated into something else. What is a world where observability collapses? Where does that play? That doesn't live in BI? That doesn't really, does it live in like the modeling layer, the metrics layer?
I mean,
go ahead, Ben.
No, I was gonna say, like, I mean, at least in one space, you could argue, at least for how some of these tools operate, right? Like, you kind of fit into wherever your actual workflow is being managed, whether it's like an orchestrator or more of just the ETL tool or ELT tool that does everything, right? Like, you could kind of argue that could fit there, right? Like, DBT kind of has part of that done with their DBT tests. So you could argue that, like, yeah, like, as part of the process, as these tables are being built, that could fit somewhere throughout the process. That's always wherever, like when I first started in the data world, that's where it was, right? Like you had your ETL, and as you were running your ETL, there were checks that you would run as you're running it into the different like raw staging, production, layer, and it was just part of the process. It wasn't a separate thing. Go ahead.
No, exactly. Like 10 years ago, a lot of this was integrated inside BI, and then we all of a sudden pulled the modeling layer and the metrics layer and made it a sort of standalone layer. And in some ways, we then took observability and metadata and pulled it out from orchestration and sort of making it its own layer, and now realizing that maybe like all of these being separate isn't the best bet, and we're talking about pushing it back into the original categories which they might have lived in the past. Ben, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have like a half-written blog post that's about like, we always talk about categories collapsing, but how will they actually collapse? Like, it's one thing to say, yeah, to your point, like there's too many tools. Like Matt Turk has his giant diagram of all of the tools. It's like, that's going to get smaller at some point. It can't keep growing to infinity. When it actually starts to collapse, like which categories start to all merge into one? If I had to guess, I would say that you basically have maybe 4 categories of things. You have essentially like pipelines that deal with third-party APIs that are just like, that is a huge pain to talk to Salesforce's API. Yeah. So something is like, okay, I will solve that problem for you, multiplied 300 times. And so that whatever direction data is moving, it's just like, this is a thing that talks to APIs. That's sort of what it does. I think there's basically like a compute, warehousing, storage layer. That seems relatively obvious. I think there's like a consumption piece of like charts and dashboards. And there's not one tool, but like a category of things that deals with like, how do we make sense of what data is doing? I think the like question mark is there a 4th category of orchestration and governance and control? Like, I want to know what's going on. I want to know like how data is moving around. I want to know if things are broken. I want to be able to define like what things mean. You could imagine sort of like DBT rolling up DBT or something rolling up DBT plus like a Dagster plus a data catalog plus some observability thing. It's like, this is where you log in to see what the hell is happening in your data world. Yeah. The honest question to me is like, that could also just be a warehouse. Like the things that Snowflake is trying to do. There are 2 ways I can imagine building a warehouse. One is just like, it's a giant computer that stores data, that crunches numbers, and we will charge you every time you use that computer. And that is it. And it is just like a big piece of hardware that you rent from us. And that's like basically AWS, but like, make it a database. I think there's a Snowflake model that is, okay, it's that computer plus a bunch of bells and whistles. Like a phone is not, a device to make phone calls. It's a thing that has to now do 50 things. Like, we don't even consider a phone, you get like a flip phone. It's like a specialized type of stupid phone. Yeah. And so I think there could be a world where like they try to make the database something that also has a lot of this like governance piece in it. And in which case the DBT orchestration, blah, blah, blah piece actually kind of makes more sense in the warehouse. And then you probably just end up with like pipes in and out, computer that does stuff, and then like charts.
Yeah. Ben, any thoughts on that? And after now it's become like selecting like the right Ben knows who is being spoken to.
We were kind of getting a trend back and forth. I think Ben, is that gonna be the title to the blog itself, like the 4th category or something?
The working title was just category collapse. There is a doc somewhere that's titled category collapse. I don't know what else it says.
Yeah. We're looking forward to that blog post coming out.
Yeah. What's interesting is I'm honestly already talking to a few different companies that have reached out to me, and they're like letting me know, they're like, hey, we're looking for ways we can like become synergetic with like other companies. Like they're like, we think we either should be acquired or we should be acquiring companies. Like who should that be? So like a lot of companies I think in this space are looking for that for multiple reasons. I think one, they want talent, they want new ways they can enter the market, they want maybe a higher selling point. Like they're looking for something that they think that they don't have because they're this small little startup, because there are so many $3 million funded startups that exist right now, and they're just looking like, okay, how do we get to that next level? And I think there's a lot of companies right now that are having those conversations to try to figure out how do we get to that next step in this whole process, in growing and also meeting more needs. So I think it is interesting seeing all these people, and even if they're already in like a well-specified category, are trying to figure out, okay, but how do we make sure we're meeting the right needs? I don't know if I have like a specific thing. Again, like I like the whole reference that Ben put out, where it's like, yeah, it's almost like orchestration / metadata layer. When I worked at Facebook, that's what it kind of was like, or it felt like everything was smooth. You put things in what is essentially Airflow, it would create a table which would automatically get pulled into the data catalog. Like everything was very much integrated. You didn't have to think like, okay, I have to like go to these different solutions. It's like, no, data quality is kind of managed in your data catalog. Your data catalog's there. You can also see the data lineage of your, Airflow and all of that stuff going on essentially. You can see who's actually using your tables in that place as well. You can see what dashboards are using. You can click and go see it. So to me, like having that like one place does kind of like speak to me. It's like, yeah, that makes sense overall.
So is the ThoughtSpot Mode acquisition the beginning of the sort of vendor consolidation? Is this the preview of finally Matt Turk? Because I think a few people were afraid that next year he's not going to have a screen size big enough to go display all of the different vendors. So is this the beginning of the sort of the reversal of the data infrastructure space?
Just as a quick point, it wasn't big enough.
Yeah.
They had to they built like an application this year to like fit everything. Go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
I mean, kind of like this isn't the beginning. This is, there's been bits and pieces of this for a little while. Like in the BI world, there was a weird, 3-week period where Mode's 3 biggest competitors all got acquired like in the same month.
Which ones?
Yeah, that's right.
Periscope, Looker, and Tableau.
Yeah.
It was just like,
Tableau, Looker. Who else was the third?
Periscope.
But what was interesting about that, they were just acquired. They weren't integrated into something else. So it's not like any of them disappeared.
Well, Periscope was more integrated into just like over time, obviously. Yeah. Looker is, I don't know, Looker's been sort of pulled apart, if anything, with like the Looker modeler thing. And I think that makes sense. Like sort of at the time, that seemed like it makes sense. Tableau is, I mean, it's a big enough business that it's kind of its own thing. But that happened in 2019. There's been a handful of acquisitions so far this year. Mode is sort of probably part of that broader trend, I think. I think like the thing to me that one of the decisions behind why we did it, part of what I was saying of like, hey, this makes sense from this big strategic perspective, but also it was like us realizing that, hey, in order for Mode to be a really big business, we have to build a BI tool, like just a straight up BI tool. And that partly comes from this category collapse of, we were selling to just like this analytics team. And there is a market there. There's a real product to build if you just sell tools that are like dedicated products for data teams, but it's not going to be that big. And it was always like a little bit of a question mark of how big it was. When the market starts to compress and people want to do like category consolidation and things like that, like then it's like, oh, actually, in order for us to be the really big business we want to be, we'd have to sort of slog through a really long time of building a lot of BI features. And I think there's a path there, but it was like, hey, we can kind of shortcut that with this step. And so I think that like there's going to be more of that type of thing where, to your point of companies coming to you saying like, where could we, who could we have a strategic partnership with? It's like realizing that, oh, this product on its own probably can't get there. We'd have to go build a bunch of other stuff. We're kind of behind in that area. We think we maybe could do it, but like maybe it's better if we all like kind of join forces and try to do it together. So I think like, it's the beginnings-ish of that. The other part of it to like the Matt Turk diagram, one of the reasons I think also that diagram blew up so much was because the market was so hot and anybody who was like ran a data team could go raise a bunch of money on a deck. And there was this like element of, this is the next career step for a data person, is to become a startup founder, because it was relatively easy to do. Not start the company, but like you could go out and raise money, and it was a straightforward enough thing that a lot of people did. And it seemed sort of like an easy career step in some ways. For data folk, part of the problem there is like data folks don't really have where do you go when you're like after a director of data? Like what's next? I don't, like, you kind of stall out. And so this was an easy, again, it's hard to start a company, not to diminish that, a very like natural step of, I see a lot of success there, I can follow that too. So I think that's also gone away a lot. And so like the category there aren't a lot of new entrants, I think, that are going to be chasing, we are X tool for the modern data stack. It just doesn't have the same cachet. You're not going to go out and raise a ton of money on a relatively early product anymore on that pitch.
Is that word still relevant? Is the modern data stack, it was all the hype, people have started saying it less. Why is that?
I think like, that like the modern data stack kind of fit a certain need for a moment. And I say specific because like, when you look at who was using it, at least in my experience, it was like small, medium-sized companies. But as soon as you went beyond that, people are using AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever exists in there, right? Like they're using AWS Glue, they're using Azure Data Factory. And so I think, it was a good term to get the space started, but I imagine like a lot of people are now like, okay, it doesn't fit everyone's needs, right? Like, so the term itself sounds like it should be like everyone should be using this, right? Like it's like, oh yeah, your large company should be using this. But for some of these solutions, if you're to use these solutions, the amount they might end up charging you might be ridiculous, just because of how they're set up. Which works great for a smaller company, right? Like using like something like a Fivetran, and you've got like tons and tons of different things you got to pull in data from. Great fit. As soon as now you're talking about 1 billion rows a month, it's like, is that as good of a fit? Especially if it's only from one source. Maybe that's not as good of a fit. Maybe doing something like a Lambda or something like that is cheaper and more efficient. And so like I think that might be why that term, like as the term becomes popular, more people start to question it, right? Like more people are like, okay, does this fit? And I don't think it fit everyone. And so I think that's maybe the reason it got kind of poked at. And yeah,
I think it just got like, it was a convenient term to describe a category of tool that was all sort of centered around the Snowflake DBT ecosystem. It represented sort of a point in time. I think it was more of like a philosophy than actually like a stack. It was products that tended to be more like consumer, sort of end user focused and selling to IT. They tended to be sort of like product led growth type companies, tended to be Silicon Valley based companies. They all tended to charge between 10 and 50K. My like semi joke about it is the definition of the modern data stack is data tools that launched on product time. Which I think is like somewhat captures actually what it is, which was this kind of like, oh, we're selling to the end user. It's not enterprise, like the Oracle Autonomous Data Warehouse. Is that part of the modern data stack? Like it kind of should be, but nobody would really say that it is.
Anything with Oracle or Microsoft just by default wasn't part of it.
Right. And so I think like in the end, it's a perfectly useful term to describe that both era and kind of tools that came out of some of that philosophy. I think it's like, as with anything that gets popular, as soon as it gets popular, there's a bunch of people, it gets overloaded with things that are kind of tag-alongs and trying to ride the hype. It gets overloaded with a bunch of people who are like, wait a minute, I want to be the naysayer and say why this thing sucks. Like there is a natural cycle to these sorts of hype things. And I think it went through that cycle. We talked about it a lot. We all got very excited about it. A bunch of people got overly excited about it. A bunch of people said it was like, it's the end of the thing, even though it's probably fine. Like, that's hype.
When did that era end? Because it was an era. When did it end? And
when Russia invaded Ukraine, that was sort of the beginning of the economy falling apart. And so that's basically to me what the modern data stack existed before this most recent bubble. Like I think it would have started 2015, 2016 is like when that first probably started being a thing. It got so hyped in 2021, 2022 when like the tech ecosystem was just going berserk. And I think like as soon as the economy started to fall apart, like that's when people were really like, wait a minute, this whole thing doesn't make that much sense. And then like, I think it makes more sense than that. I think there's actually plenty of good stuff that'll come out of it. I think there'll be a lot of lasting companies that come out of it. But I don't know that it's not going to be an ecosystem of 10,000 companies or however many things are on Matt Turk's diagram.
I know we're almost out of time, so I want one last question, and I would love to get a controversial opinion from the both of you. So, what do you think? What would be a sort of crazy but somewhat believable? What's Ben, and I know you do a bunch of these. What does it look like if DBT fails, or things like that? But what would be either an acquisition, a collapse, or, something which might sound crazy today, but really directionally, you think we're heading in that direction in the next 18 months?
Oh, 18 months. Jeez, that's so short. Oh, yeah.
Before the end of 2024.
Yeah.
Something which 2 years ago, we would have been like, this is never going to happen. Because I think we're starting to see a few of that, right? Like 2 years ago, I would have never guessed Mode would be acquired. It just at the peak of the hype cycle, I didn't see a world where, we knew it would collapse at some point, but we didn't know it's going to happen this soon. And so what do you think are some of the things which would, some of the crazy predictions you would have in the next?
I would make one point of clarification on things collapsing. This category is not necessarily companies. Mode did not collapse. Just want to make sure that.
No, definitely. I was talking about. You're right. Thanks for the clarification.
Yeah. Sounds like you're speaking more generally. Like what's a crazy event? Like DBT gets acquired by Snowflake. I don't think it's gonna happen. I have two answers to this. One is actually that, though I would say DBT and Databricks. I think there's a world in which that actually makes a lot of sense.
The Databricks sort of acquired DBT.
Yeah, the reason for that is like one, DBT has like a pricing problem. Like this is a thing they're trying to figure out. I think it's like relatively rational what they did. I think as far as pricing goes for DBT, it makes sense, but it's like something that consumers are kind of sensitive to. Living inside of a warehouse, you basically could get DBT for free, but like Databricks would love it because it just drives compute to Databricks. So like it sort of makes sense in a data warehouse thing because it's a very good driver of compute. You kind of get this nice service that you don't have to pay for. Like suddenly the pricing issue of DBT goes away. So in that world, it makes sense.
Does that mean sort of DBT doesn't work on Snowflake?
I think it could, but like you would get more dedicated things inside of DBT. Like it's great. You're using DBT with Snowflake. We can automatically port your Snowflake warehouse to Databricks because you have this kind of control layer that sits on top of it. It like makes this really nice migration path. The other part is DBT is valued in two ways. DBT is valued based on the revenue, and they are valued based on kind of their community impact. And like the bigger the company they get, the first one matters a lot more than the second one. And like Wall Street doesn't care at all about the second one. Like Wall Street's like, show us the money, basically. And so DBT has to do this process of basically turning community impact into money. That's long, that's hard. I think they can do it. Like, they have a lot of like ability to try to solve this problem, I think. But Databricks is a sort of running in second place in like the sort of modern data warehouse market. Where Snowflake kind of became the default, and Databricks was this data science thing that they're now trying to sell, as you mentioned, Ben, like more traditional data warehouse workloads. They don't really have that kind of mind share. And so I think like to them, the community actually is valuable. Like they would pay for the community because suddenly Databricks is cool or whatever. Like they suddenly have 50,000 companies that are using this thing that they probably have a harder time selling to. So I think like there's a world where that actually makes sense. And I think that would be the sort of thing that like makes a really big
splash,
oh my God, moment in this ecosystem. I have no idea what's going to happen. There's a lot of things I'm sure that would keep it from happening. And DBT still has a whole bunch of money to solve a lot of problems. And I know they have big ambitions to do this. And so like, that's not exactly how it happens, but I could see there being rational reasons for it.
No, thanks. That's great, Ben. I know we're out of time, but Ben would love a crazy prediction.
I don't know if I have anything that's that crazy. Shoot. I was like, oh, we're out of time. Perfect. Because like to me, I'm like, that would have been one of them. I obviously was joking about Snowflake, but yeah, I think the Databricks makes more sense. I don't know. Trying to think, like, does anything happen with Fivetran? Does that get purchased by anybody? Or the other? I mean, I imagine they're going to go public here in the next 12 to 18 months. Is their probably goal? I don't know. I don't know if I have anything specific that would be crazy.
My Fivetran one is Salesforce. I think if anybody buys Fivetran, it should be Salesforce because they sort of are attempting to like collect data in a bunch of different ways. And like suddenly Fivetran being like a pipe less into warehouses, but like into Salesforce suddenly is like, oh, wait, you can start to sell. They want to be this kind of hub of like enterprise productivity and tooling. It's like, there's maybe worlds in which that makes sense. You know, things like MuleSoft, actually, they already sort of do. So,
yeah, that's true. They do want to be.
And now, like,
the one.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was gonna say the one reason that also makes sense is because, like, right, like Salesforce, was it last year? I don't think they've done it yet, right? Like, announced like we're gonna have a direct pipeline that pushes into Snowflake, and I don't think they've done it yet.
I don't think they've done
it. So you know, that would answer that question tomorrow.
Be a very expensive way to buy a pipeline of writing, but you know, Mark Benioff. It just takes Mark Benioff to get excited about it for a week, and he'll write some huge check.
I mean,
like, you know,
cloud is a warehouse. So there's a new warehouse in the market, and that's Data Cloud, and all Salesforce data goes into Data Cloud. And if you want to push it anywhere else, it goes from Data Cloud elsewhere. So it's definitely super relevant because they kind of that's a super interesting thesis.
Or like Oracle does it, and this is their way to, like, you know, stay in the game, is like, we now have all these.
We should be thinking about like Teradata or Vertica, like somehow, like they purchased DBT and they're trying to be the cool case.
Like,
that would be the Teradata acquires DBT one would be a surprise. That would be I would not see that one coming.
I mean, all of this is relevant, right? Because, like, we saw this year that a company came back from the dead, right? Like Bing search, like, came back from
Bard,
with OpenAI.
But that's like a cheat, because that's Microsoft. Like Bing came back from the dead because it's a part of the second biggest company in the world. Like that feels like that's a product coming back from the dead, being supported by $1 trillion of God knows what behind it.
Especially when you think of Salesforce, when you think of Oracle, when you think of companies like this, they are capable of, like, going and making an acquisition and literally be like, hey, the future actually is now Oracle sort of warehouse, which, you know, we would have never.
Which it honestly, it's not even the future. It is. Like, I don't know the exact numbers on this. I remember seeing it that I want to say it was like 6 months ago. The Oracle Autonomous Data Warehouse, which we all, like, sort of make fun of as this, like, oh, this is the whole, you know, crazy thing. I think it makes about as much money as Databricks. Like, they rolled it out in like a year, it got to like $1 billion. And it's like, that's what, or like, it is, that isn't the path, like, that's where all the money actually is. You know, can Snowflake or Databricks become something way big? Obviously, like, those companies could potentially far exceed that, and maybe the thing stalls. But, like, Oracle isn't some old, like, decrepit thing that is dying in the corner. It's like, no, Oracle is way bigger than all of these things. And, like, SQL Server still probably makes 5 to 10 times as much as Snowflake does. Like, this stuff is everywhere. And this is not a back from the dead. This is how they, like, kill the startups that think that they're, like, slowly going to beat them. It's like, no, we'll just
Slack. I mean, kill it, but Zoom or whatever.
Exactly.
Awesome, guys.
We just put it into our product. Now compete.
No, thank you both so much. I think at the end of all of these, we get a good insight into where things, you know, at least some open questions. And at the end of these, we typically just have more questions than when we began. And I think a point of a lot of this is to start this conversation. So really, really appreciate it. I know we're over time, and sort of thank you to all the listeners. Sorry we didn't have time for questions. And chat soon. See you guys in a month.
Thanks. And I can answer the very first question, which is, what are the best ways to stay up to date on the latest data engineering technologies? It's subscribe to Benn's blog.
Yes. Oh, which one?
Well, subscribe to the Seattle Data Guys blog.
I was joking. It's just such a
both have been a source of inspiration for me. I read both of them, so they both are incredible resources. Thanks. Thanks.
Cool. Yep. Good to see y'all. Thanks for having us.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.